30 years, 3 decades, building a man that America believed would never fall. And it didn't all collapse in one moment. It's breaking apart, bit by bit, right in front of our eyes. There is a rare kind of athlete who doesn't just play the game for the world. He makes the world believe that strength is real, that willpower can defeat every limit, that if you're tough enough, you'll never have to stop, that the man under the helmet is the same man in real life. No fear, no weakness, never backing down. Brett Favre was that man, living proof that a boy from Mississippi could stand in the middle of the NFL's harshest collisions and never miss a single game, that you could get knocked down over and over and still get back up like nothing happened. 297 consecutive games. No breaks, no stops, no admitting pain. But what happens when the man who never stops starts losing control of his own body? What happens when the hits the whole world cheered for come back, not on the field, but inside his own mind? How does a person who spent his whole life proving he couldn't be broken face the slow and cruel truth that some things have been taken away forever? What's really happening inside a body once seen as invincible? What did all those years of never quitting accumulate, that the stadium lights never revealed? And why, after everything, might the fact that he never stopped be the most dangerous thing he ever did? Before we answer all those questions, we have to go back to the beginning, back to a boy who learned very early that pain wasn't something to avoid, but something to endure, that if you stopped, you'd disappear, and that sometimes what makes the whole world admire you is also what will follow you your entire life. He never stopped playing, and now his body won't let him forget it. If this story makes you pause and think, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next parts where even more painful truths will be revealed. Before the packed stadiums, before the throws that shook all of America, Brett Favre's life began in a much quieter place, but also a much heavier one. Kiln, Mississippi wasn't a place that bred big dreams. It was a place that bred endurance. A small town where men didn't talk about feelings, where tears weren't accepted, and where a boy's worth was measured by his ability to stand firm when everything around him started to crumble. Brett's father, Irvin Favre, wasn't a cruel father in the way people often imagine. He didn't abandon the family, didn't disappear, didn't turn his back. He was there, every day present, disciplined, strict, and almost never soft. He was the coach, the teacher, the standard Brett had to meet, but rarely the place Brett could go for comfort. Love existed, but it wasn't spoken. It wasn't shown with hugs, but with expectations. Not with praise, but with silence when you weren't good enough yet. And for a child, that silence could sometimes feel heavier than criticism. In that house, there wasn't much room for weakness. Long days passed with unspoken rules. No complaining, no collapsing, no letting others see you hurt. If you were injured, you got up. If you failed, you did it again. And if you felt fear, you buried it deep, as if it never existed. Brett learned those things not through lectures, but through the air he breathed every day. A tense atmosphere where love and pressure coexisted, where a child had to learn to protect himself, not from the outside world, but from the feeling that he was never enough in the eyes of the person he most wanted to please. There were afternoons on the small field as the southern sun began to soften. Brett stood there, throwing ball after ball, not because he loved the game from the start, but because it was the only way to be seen. Each throw was a silent plea. See me, acknowledge me, tell me I'm good enough. But those words rarely came, and gradually Brett stopped waiting for them. Instead, he learned to create a version of himself that needed no confirmation from anyone else. A version that didn't know fatigue, didn't know pain, didn't know stopping. Other kids might be taught that love comes first, that you're accepted even when you fail. But for Brett, what came first was pain, the pain of having to prove, to endure, to be stronger than his own emotions. And over time, He began to believe that was the only way to survive, that if you were tough enough, you wouldn't need anyone, that if you never fell, you'd never be abandoned. But there was a price for that belief. When you learn not to feel pain, you also gradually lose the ability to feel other things: tenderness, safety, the feeling of being loved without having to prove anything. Brett didn't know that as a kid. He only knew that with each passing day, he became tougher, quieter, and less in need of others, and the world around him, a world that celebrated strength, celebrated endurance, reinforced it, turning it into a virtue, a pride. But deep inside, where no one could see, there was still a child who was never really asked how he felt, a child who learned to swallow everything inward, turning pain into fuel, silence into a shield. And as the years passed, that shield grew so thick that it not only kept the outside world out, but also kept Brett from reaching the truest parts of himself. That's where the real story begins, not on the field, not under the lights, but in a house where love existed but was never spoken, where a boy learned that to be accepted he had to become what the world needed: strong, unbreakable, never stopping. And from that moment, something almost inevitable was shaped. When pain comes before love, endurance replaces emotion. And one day, that very thing would become both the greatest strength and the greatest tragedy of his life. And from that foundation, from a childhood where emotions were suppressed and endurance was seen as the condition for survival, Brett Favre didn't just grow up. He was forged into a man who had almost no choice but to never fall. What began as a survival mechanism gradually became his identity, not a part of him, but his entire being. On the high school field, then college, then his early stumbling days in the NFL, Brett didn't stand out for perfect technique or absolute accuracy. He stood out for something harder to name: an almost extreme stubbornness, a will that refused to yield even when his body sent clear signals that it was time to stop. But stopping was never an option he allowed himself to consider. Every hit, every time he was driven into the turf, every pain shooting through his body wasn't seen as a sign of limits, but as a test of honor. Others could step out of bounds, could ask to be subbed, could admit they needed rest. Brett didn't. Not because he didn't hurt, but because he didn't allow that pain to have a voice. In the world he grew up in, pain wasn't something to be listened to. It was something to be overcome, ignored, buried so deep that even he no longer recognized it. Gradually, that created an unspoken rule inside him: if you stop, you're weak. If you're weak, you're worthless. And if you're worthless, you'll disappear. Not disappear physically, but in a more terrifying way. You're no longer seen, no longer recognized, no longer exist in the eyes of those around you. And for Brett, that was unacceptable. He didn't just play to win. He played to make sure he was never invisible again. The consecutive streak didn't start as a goal, but as a consequence. One game, then 2, then 10, then 50. Each time he took the field was a reminder to himself that he was still here, still strong enough, still unbroken. But along with every game, other things were accumulating: small injuries, concussions with no rest, body parts that never got full recovery. And the most dangerous part was, he knew. He felt it, but he chose silence. There were days when just getting out of bed was a challenge. Throws where his arm barely obeyed his will anymore. Hits where his head spun, the stadium lights blurring for endless seconds. But when the clock started, when the crowd began to roar, all those signals got pushed back. Because if he stopped, if he admitted he wasn't okay, the entire system he'd built around himself would collapse. Not just his career, but his very self. Teammates looked at him with admiration. Coaches trusted him as an icon of resilience. Fans celebrated him as a warrior who never fell. And every look, every praise, reinforced a belief that had been ingrained in him for so long, that his worth lay in never breaking. never slowing down, never letting anyone see him as human with limits, with fear, with the moments of weakness everyone has. But the price didn't come all at once. It didn't crash down like a storm. It came slowly, quietly, almost unnoticeable in each individual moment. A shoulder ache that wouldn't go away, a dizziness that lasted longer than usual, an unexplained fatigue. Little by little, his body began to record everything he'd refused to acknowledge. And while the world saw an unbreakable man, inside, cracks had started to form. The tragedy isn't that Brett didn't know. It's that he didn't know what else to do. Because if he chose another path, if he rested, if he admitted limits, if he allowed himself to be human, he'd have to face a question he'd avoided his whole life. If not the man who never falls, then who is he? And so he kept going, game after game, season after season. Each time he stepped onto the field was a reaffirmation of his identity, not with words, but with action, by getting up after every fall, by continuing when everything inside was already screaming that enough was enough. But he didn't listen. He never learned how to listen, because deep inside him there was an unshakable belief, an unspoken sentence that defined every decision he made. If he broke, he would disappear. And for Brett Favre, disappearing was never an option, even when the cost of existing was trading away pieces of himself. But before the world called him a legend, before the numbers became legacy, there was a period when Brett Favre wasn't the icon of durability. He was just a name overlooked, not because he didn't try, not because he didn't endure enough, but because, in the eyes of those who made the decisions, he simply was not enough, not accurate enough, not disciplined enough, not safe enough to put faith in. In college, he had flashes of brilliance, bold throws others wouldn't dare attempt. But along with that came mistakes, risks, the sense that he couldn't control himself the way the system demanded. And in an environment where stability was valued over personality, that became a bigger minus than any plus he could produce. When he stepped into the NFL, the dream he'd built with everything he had finally seen to come true. He was drafted by the Atlanta Falcons, but the reality he walked into wasn't like that dream. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a much colder challenge. Prove you deserve to exist in a place where no one really believed you belonged. Those early days with the Falcons had no spotlight, no patience, no hand on the shoulder saying, "We believe in you." Instead, there were doubting looks, quick decisions, and the system not willing to wait for someone like Brett Favre to mature. He wasn't given a real chance to fail or to learn. And when there's no chance, every small mistake became evidence for a preset conclusion that he wasn't the one they were looking for. The rare times he got on the field weren't opportunities to shine, but brief moments long enough to reinforce the prejudice that he couldn't control the game, that he was too reckless, too wild to fit in the NFL. And then, before he could even figure out where he was, the story was almost over. Some dreams don't shatter with one big shock. They fade away, bit by bit, in silence. And for Brett, those days with the Falcons were exactly that. No official statement that he failed. No dramatic moment. Just an increasingly clear feeling that he wasn't needed, wasn't trusted, wasn't seen. And for someone who'd built his entire identity on never being overlooked, that was a deeper cut than any injury on the field. He was deemed not enough, not good enough to lead a team, not stable enough to hand the future to, not mature enough to be the face of anything. And in an environment like the NFL, not enough isn't a phase, it's a sentence. Others might get time to develop. Brett didn't. He became a name people mentioned as an example, a talent that could have been, but never would be. But what they didn't understand, what no one in that system could see, was that for Brett, being seen as not enough wasn't just a professional evaluation. It touched a much deeper place. It touched the child who'd grown up feeling he always had to prove his worth, that if you weren't strong enough, good enough, tough enough, you'd be left behind. The Falcons didn't create that fear. They just confirmed it. There were nights when Brett had to sit alone, facing a question he'd never really allowed himself to think about. If everything he'd done, everything he'd endured, every time he'd gotten up when he should have stayed down, still wasn't enough, then what else was there? If even when he never broke, he still wasn't chosen, then what was the point of it all? But instead of collapsing, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He tightened his grip. He got quieter. He got more determined, not because he believed things would be okay, but because he had no other choice. Because if he accepted that they were right, that he wasn't enough, then everything he'd built since he was a kid would collapse with it, and he couldn't let that happen. The world looked at Brett Favre at that time and saw a failed player, a bust draft pick, someone who didn't fit the system. But inside, something else was happening. Not an ending, but an accumulation. Every time he was overlooked, every time he was doubted, every time he was deemed not enough, none of it disappeared. It was held onto, pushed deeper, turned into fuel for something that hadn't exploded yet, but was surely forming. And maybe that's the most ironic part of this period. The Falcons thought they were getting rid of an unfit player. But in reality, they were only pushing a man closer to the version the world would later never forget. A version built not from recognition, but from rejection. Not from others' belief, but from no one believing in him. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do to someone like Brett Favre is make them believe they're not enough. Because if they don't fall from that, they'll spend their whole life proving you wrong. Then an opportunity Brett Favre never imagined finally appeared. Like a faint light piercing through the long nights of doubt and rejection, he was traded to the Green Bay Packers, a team that outsiders only saw as victories, pre-built legends. But for Favre, it was a completely new chessboard, where he had to prove everything from scratch, where he couldn't afford a single wrong move. When he first stepped into Lambeau Field, there were no fans cheering for his past, no reminders that those 297 consecutive games had shaped who he was. Everything was a blank slate, and every throw, every decision, every scramble had to prove he existed, that he deserved to be here. Not for wins, but because he'd never been allowed to disappear. His first season with the Packers wasn't easy at all. Favre stepped into every game with an almost desperate intensity, sometimes astonishing teammates, sometimes making coaches hold their breath. He threw with a speed, a recklessness that only those who'd felt the fear of being abandoned could understand. Every pass wasn't just strategy. It was a declaration. I'm still here. I haven't disappeared. Those long bombs didn't just beat defenders, they beat the prejudices, the doubts, the dismissive looks the Falcons had once given him. Every touchdown wasn't just a win. It was a period affirming that he existed, that he hadn't been erased from this world. Favre wasn't playing to become MVP, wasn't playing to win a Super Bowl right away. He was playing to prove, even when he himself hadn't fully understood why he had to prove. Deep in his mind, he knew that if he accepted that no one believed in him, if he accepted failure, then he himself would disappear. Not just on the field, but in the eyes of the whole world, in the eyes of those who doubted him, and, more importantly, in his own eyes. Every game was an inner battle, between pain and existence, between a weary body and a will that never yielded. Favre learned to stand up even when his shoulder was nearly numb, when his head spun, when his legs wanted to refuse one more step, because if he stopped, no one would stand up for him, no one would remind him he deserved to exist. And like a habit ingrained in his being, Favre stepped into every game as if there was no tomorrow. Not because he was a win-obsessed maniac, but because he wasn't allowed to let himself be forgotten. Those nights at Lambeau Field, when the cold wind blew through, when the crowd roared, Favre felt every heartbeat of his merge with the team's. But at the same time, every pain from the past, every accumulated hit from previous seasons still reminded him that life was never easy, that he had to keep going, not for victory, but for existence. His teammates gradually noticed something unusual about Favre. Not just talent, not just masterful throwing ability, but a different mental intensity. He played with something bigger than himself in existence, constantly tested by those who'd once seen him as not enough. And every throw, every run, every reckless decision didn't just change the game's outcome. It changed how the world saw him. A player everyone once doubted now began making fans, teammates, and opponents pause, having to admit he couldn't be overlooked. In those rare, quiet moments when the stadium lights went out, Favre sat alone, staring at the leather ball on the floor, feeling that everything he did wasn't just for fame, not just for contracts or awards, but because he'd never been allowed to disappear. Every hit, every game, every season was proof that he still existed, that he was still Brett Favre, even as his body grew tired, even as the wounds accumulated over the years relentlessly reminded him of his limits. He'd built his entire identity on the foundation of never falling, and now, with the Green Bay Packers' opportunity appearing, all he could do was keep stepping onto the field as if tomorrow would never come, as if his existence depended on every throw, every run, every decision in every moment. And truthfully, for Brett Favre, it did. And so, every early game with the Packers wasn't just a new start. It was a powerful declaration. He wasn't playing to win, he was playing to prove he existed. That despite every doubt, every judgment, every limit others placed, Brett Favre was still here, alive, breathing, fighting, and had never fallen. Every pass, every completion, every long bomb was silent but undeniable evidence that what he feared most disappearing would not happen. He couldn't stop playing, and that was how he kept existing. Strong, resilient, despite every limit of body and time. And then, as if it was destiny written in stone, Brett Favre stepped into the phase where the whole world began to applaud him, seeing him as an unbreakable icon. MVP, Super Bowl, his name appearing on every newspaper, every TV channel, every broadcast, a true American hero. A tireless warrior whom people admired from Mississippi to Wisconsin, from the stands to living rooms everywhere. The numbers, the wins, the trophies, it all seemed to prove he'd fulfilled every expectation, every dream that the boy from Overbrook had quietly wished for. But beneath the stadium lights and the endless cheers, there were cracks the public never saw. Hits that Favre himself endured in silence and was never allowed to reveal. Every game, every throw was proof of his resilience, but also proof of the damage accumulating year after year, minor injuries dismissed as normal from one season to the next, seemingly light collisions quietly destroying his shoulder, neck, head, and memory. Favre never allowed himself to rest, never admitted that one day his body might betray him. Every time the crowd roared, every time the stadium lights shone down on the field, he had to suppress every ache, every sign of fatigue, keeping his smile, his eyes, and his movements flawless. The louder the crowd, the quieter his pain had to be. The more applause, the more eyes watching, the more his inner pain was suppressed, buried deeper, becoming even more silent. With the Packers, Favre wasn't just a player. He was the center of the team, the soul of Lambeau Field, the one teammates relied on and fans expected to lead them to victory. And he did all of it under a weight no one could see. The crushing pressure to be perfect, to endure, to live up to the standard he'd set for himself since he was a boy who learned weakness wasn't allowed. Every pass he threw, every scramble out of pressure, every decision on the field carried absolute focus. But inside, His body was taking the brunt of a pile of accumulated injuries he'd never told anyone about. For Favre, winning was never the only goal. The real goal was proving he existed, that the months of doubt, being overlooked, being seen as not enough, could never erase him. Every MVP award, every Super Bowl trophy lift. People saw an icon, but few knew that icon was forged from unspeakable pain, from moments of exhaustion when he still had to stand tall, from sleepless nights when his body reminded him the limit was near. That's why the brighter the success, the quieter the pain. The louder the crowd, the quieter his pain had to be. No one but him witnessed the sweat mixed with blood, the silent groans during practice, the hits his body had to brace against, and the fear that if he ever fell, everything he'd built from Overbrook to Lambeau Field would collapse. Every season was a new test. Coaches, teammates, and fans saw an elite warrior. But Favre knew he wasn't just playing for wins or fame. He was playing to keep himself alive in a world that didn't forgive weakness. The hits didn't just hurt his body, they reminded him of childhood memories, the fears the boy Favre carried from Mississippi, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of never being seen, the fear that if he fell, his very existence would be wiped clean. And so he kept going, stepping onto the field with an almost desperate resolve, with a body betraying him and a mind knowing everyone only saw the surface, the touchdowns, the wins, the cheers. He kept the pain silent, let his body endure, let fatigue stay hidden. The louder the cheers, the more lights shining, the more silent the pain had to be. But it was precisely those things, the hits, the pain, the sleepless nights, and that crushing pressure that forged Brett Favre, not just an NFL icon, but one of endurance, of willpower, of a man who refused to let himself disappear no matter what. And while the whole world cheered, Brett Favre was still facing his greatest challenge, fighting himself, the accumulated injuries, the pain no one could see, and the pressure that if he fell, no one else could save him. The price of becoming a legend was profound loneliness, silent pain, every throw, every run, every moment having to prove he existed, he hadn't fallen, he was still here, no matter how much it hurt. The louder the crowd, the quieter his pain had to be. And that was the truth few could understand about the man America once applauded and honored. And like any warrior, endurance is never infinite. And even Brett Favre, the icon of durability, the man who never fell, had limits he'd never thought he'd reach. When the stadium lights went out, when the cheers fell silent, his body began to speak in ways his will could no longer suppress. Accumulated injuries, relentless hits, seasons without rest left scars not just on his shoulder, knees, or head, but on his spirit. To endure, to keep standing, Brett began turning to Vicodin, the powerful painkiller NFL players used to push through pain their bodies had been warning about for too long. At first, it was just a tool to finish games, to not miss opportunities, to not disappear in the eyes of teammates, coaches, and fans. But that tool gradually became something else, something he no longer controlled. The pills started taking up space in his life, not for riches or recreation, but to help him maintain the Iron Man image the world had grown used to seeing. Every time pain surged in his shoulder, arm, or head, Vicodin was the quick, easy fix. But it came with a silent cost: dependence. The strongest man on the field, the one who'd made millions look up at every throw, now had to rely on a drug to keep existing, not through his body, his skill, or his will, but through pills he told himself were necessary to not fall. At first, Favre told himself he had it under control. He still took the field, still threw beautiful passes, still brought wins to the Packers. But Vicodin didn't just dull pain. It blurred every limit, made him forget his body's warnings, pulled him into a state where the feeling of "I'm still okay" became fake. The rare off days meant for recovery were filled with more pills, so he never truly got to slow down. And then the dependence grew, turning into a vicious cycle. The more he used, the more tired his body became, the more stressed his mind, the more he needed to keep up the image of the man who never falls. The most tragic part was that those around him still saw Brett Favre as the icon, still cheered, still admired. No one saw the pills, no one saw the strain, no one realized the man they honored every day was struggling with a power he couldn't control. The strongest man in the NFL, Wisconsin's hero, the one who kept the Packers steady through so many seasons, now nearly dependent on an addictive substance to maintain everything he'd once been proud of. Every time he stepped onto the field was a victory over his body and pain, but also a moment when the dependence quietly etched deeper into his life. Favre knew it himself. He felt every sign. Every minute his body betrayed him. Every pain that no longer belonged just to the physical, but had turned spiritual. But to admit that weakness, to give up the only defense mechanism he had, also meant admitting that he, the man America admired, wasn't strong enough. Not strong enough to endure without help. Not strong enough to stand without pills. And so he kept going. He kept playing, kept throwing, kept running, kept living like a man who never falls. But inside, his body and mind were gradually being overtaken by Vicodin, gradually controlled. Those silent nights after games, when all the lights went out and the fans left, Brett had to face himself. The man everyone thought was invincible, strong, and tireless, now had to admit he was nearly self-destructing, not because of opponents, not because of on-field pressure, but because of his own body and the substance he'd placed his trust in to keep existing. The pills, once a lifeline, now became chains. The wins, once pride, now just proof of a controlled existence, a life constantly tested. And in that loneliness, Favre still stepped onto the field as if there was no tomorrow, not to win, not to set records. He played to prove to himself that he still existed, that this dependence couldn't destroy the identity formed from those overbrooked days, from childhood hits, from the fear of abandonment, from the silent reminder that if he fell, he'd disappear. The strongest man, dependent. But Brett Favre, as always, didn't stop. He kept stepping onto the field, kept throwing, kept playing, kept living, because if he stopped, if he admitted he'd lost control, then everything he'd ever built would vanish along with the body and memory he'd fought so hard to hold together. And so, despite the silent dependence, despite the accumulating injuries, despite the growing fear, Favre kept moving forward, not for victory, but for existence, for never disappearing. On one fall night, when leaves covered the Packers' practice field, devastating news came to Brett Favre without any warning. His father, the man who'd been both inspiration and pressure throughout his childhood, had taken his last breath. Irvin Favre, the one Brett had chased every expectation for, sought approval from all those years as a Mississippi boy, was gone. Yet the next morning, without a moment's delay, Brett Favre still stepped onto the field, in his uniform still soaked with sweat from the previous day's practice, in eyes full of silent pain only he understood. Everyone around saw a player ready to play. They saw a hero preparing for an important game, but inside, his heart was heavy, his mind spinning, and the grief so overwhelming that every breath became a bigger challenge than any throw he'd ever made. Favre didn't sit out, didn't ask for a break, didn't allow his body and mind to collapse. He stepped into the game as if everything was still normal, as if yesterday hadn't happened at all, but on the field, every hit, every throw, every scramble carried the pain of his entire life, not to prove anything to his teammates or the fans, but to prove to himself he still existed. He was still the one who stood tall, even though inside he was nearly shattered. The fans cheered, cameras panned relentlessly, the press flooded with articles praising his miraculous performance. But what they didn't see was every heartbeat, every silent ache running along his spine, every childhood memory, every fear that if he stopped moving forward, a lifetime of resilience would vanish. In that game, he played as if there was no tomorrow. Every long bomb, every escape from pressure carried a tension only Brett could feel. Every successful throw wasn't just points or a win. It was proof of his own existence. Favre had learned from his father that weakness wasn't allowed, that if you admitted pain, you'd disappear. And this time, when real loss hit him, he didn't know how to stop, because the instinct was etched into every cell: play, endure, exist. It wasn't strength that kept him going. It was the fact that he didn't know how to stop. His teammates saw something unusual. Favre's eyes were still bright, still fierce, but hidden deep within was an unshareable pain, a grief he'd never been allowed to express. The coaches knew he was playing under difficult emotional conditions, but Favre didn't ask to sit out, didn't request help. The game became a display of sheer will, proof that durability wasn't measured just by muscle or technique, but by the ability to stay upright amid overwhelming loss. Every hit that shot pain through his shoulder, every run that left his legs aching. But he kept going, because if he stopped, everything would disappear in the way only he understood. Fans later recounted that performance as one of Favre's legendary games. But that legend didn't come from perfect skill, physical power, or spectacular plays. The legend came from quiet resilience, from a man standing firm while everything inside was crumbling, from turning pain, loss, and childhood memories into energy to keep playing. Every throw, every run, every decision on the field carried a pain he'd hidden throughout his childhood and career, now surging quietly but powerfully. And the most astonishing thing was that after the game ended, when the crowd roared, when teammates slapped his back in congratulations, Brett Favre still stood there, flashing the gentle smile everyone was used to seeing. But inside, the pain still lingered. He didn't stop playing not for victory, not for glory, but because instinct had turned pain into a survival drive. It wasn't muscle strength or strategy that powered him through that legendary game. It was the silent strength from never having learned to stop, never allowing himself weakness, never admitting that even the strongest man sometimes needs rest. And so that night became a wordless testament to the real Brett Favre, a warrior of endurance, a living legend, not just because of talent, but because of his ability to stand against pain, against loss, against his own body and memories. No one else could do it. And that's why that game, even though it brought a win to the team, etched a tragic, painful, deeply emotional story the outside world would never fully see. A man who didn't know how to stop. And that very thing created an unforgettable, legendary moment. And then, when the stadium lights went out, when the cheers fell silent, Brett Favre still kept stepping onto the field, step by step, throw by throw, run by run, as if he were constantly fighting his own body. Every game, every season, was no longer just a test of skill or strategy. It was a war against unpredictable hits, shoves, blows his body could no longer fully recover from, concussions, head trauma, brutal impacts to his shoulder, neck, knees, and back became inseparable parts of his legendary career. Every game he played, his body lost a piece of strength, a piece of reflexes, a piece only he could feel, and those pieces never came back. Every game took something he never got back. Not just physically, but mentally, energetically. The peace of knowing he was still whole to keep going. Favre learned to hide that pain, learned to stand tall even when his heart raced, his head spun, his shoulder throbbed, and his legs wanted to refuse. The next game, the next season, fans, teammates, and coaches saw a strong, resilient man, but no one saw the cracks growing clearer, silently but relentlessly widening in his body. It wasn't just the hits. It was the cumulative effect, small injuries, dismissed as normal through season after season, game after game, gradually becoming permanent damage, indelible marks in his head, muscles, joints. Every collision wasn't just immediate pain. It was a debt his body had to pay day after day, year after year, and he knew it would never be paid off. His teammates saw Brett Favre as a living icon, never missing a game, never stopping his runs, never admitting weakness. But inside, every time he sat alone in the locker room after a game, every time the stadium lights went quiet after the roar, he felt clearly that his body was starting to betray him. The accumulated hits didn't just cause physical pain. They made him question himself. Was he still strong enough to continue? Was he losing what mattered most? But stopping was never an option, because for a long time, Favre had known that if he let himself rest, if he let his body decide, the image of a legend, of the man who never fell, would vanish before the world's eyes. And the cruel truth was that even as everyone saw him smiling, throwing, winning, his body was steadily declining. Every game didn't just drain energy. It took memory, reflexes, parts of his body he'd once believed were durable and endless. Favre later said, looking back on his career, that those hits didn't just leave immediate injuries but long-lasting consequences. Chronic pain, unrelenting fatigue, sometimes insomnia, sometimes early signs of brain trauma he could never fully recover from. He paid the price with every throw, every run, every game, and the true value of those wins never matched the silent pain he carried. Every season, he stepped onto the field with absolute focus, but the pain from previous games followed him quietly. Concussions didn't just make senses hypersensitive, they made him relive past blows like a repeating soundtrack that never stopped, reminding him no victory was free, no moment of glory left no mark. Fans only saw a powerful icon, but Favre knew that strength was trading away pieces of his body, pieces of memory, pieces of peace in his mind. The most tragic part was that it was from his own strength and durability that he created crushing pressure on himself. The more successful, the more admired, the more MVPs, the more legendary he became, the more accumulated pain was hidden. The louder the crowd, the quieter his pain had to be. Every cheer, every stadium light, every trophy only made the inner pain grow silently larger, buried deeper, making him feel no one could see the real, vulnerable man struggling minute by minute. And yet, despite everything, Brett Favre kept stepping onto the field as if there was no tomorrow. Every game was a silent declaration. He was still here, he hadn't disappeared, he still existed, despite every accumulated hit, despite every injury, despite every limit his body had warned about. But inside, the man once seen as the NFL's strongest was enduring a silent crisis, a physical tragedy no audience ever witnessed. Every game took something from him he could never reclaim. And that created a tragic story, a legend both celebrated and quietly tormented by his body and time. Every game took something he never got back. And then, like an unrelenting wave, Brett Favre left the Green Bay Packers, moving to new shores, hoping to keep proving himself. On paper, it was a fresh opportunity, a new chapter in his storied career. He joined the New York Jets, then later the Minnesota Vikings, where fans who'd never known him from the Overbrook days now watched a legend step onto the field with his iconic style. But inside, his body was no longer a loyal companion. The injuries accumulated from 2 decades on the field, the unrecovered hits and concussions, the muscles and joints that had borne too much, all began imposing limits. His will could no longer stretch forever. Every time Favre stepped onto the field, no one could see the silent pain flowing through every vein, every joint, every nerve. His body had betrayed him, but his spirit, his instinct, and something etched deep from his Mississippi childhood kept him from letting go, from stopping. The world still saw a decisive player, an indomitable man. But only Favre understood that every run, every throw, every drive he led came at the cost of worn-down strength and gradually fading memory. He played not for wins, not for fame or money, but because if he stopped, if he let his body rest, everything he'd built over 2 decades would vanish. And more importantly, Key himself would vanish in his own eyes. Those early days with the Jets were a challenge not just physically, but mentally. Favre knew his body couldn't endure like before. But every time he felt the sharp pain, he reminded himself, "Get up, keep going, no stopping allowed." The field didn't forgive weakness, and Favre had never learned how to let go. Even as his body sent warning signals, even as pain spread from shoulder to back and knees, he still stepped up like a soldier who never retreated. People talked about the games, the accurate passes, the drives into history, but few knew Favre was fighting his own body against limits time and injury had set. When he moved to the Vikings, things weren't any better. Fans cheered, teammates trusted, coaches still saw him as an icon, but Favre knew clearly his body was turning against every effort. Even with tired legs, throbbing shoulders, old injuries not fully healed, he still threw, still ran, still took the field. Not because he was young, not because of lingering ambition, but because something had become his essence. He couldn't stop, couldn't let go. If he stopped, if he admitted he no longer had the strength, he'd face a terrifying emptiness. Inside the emptiness he'd learned to hide from Overbrook. From his early NFL days, when the fear of being seen as not enough drove him forward. The tragedy is that the more he played, the more his body signaled that the limit was drawing near. But his will only grew stronger. Every throw, every run, every gain became proof of his endurance, but also a brutal struggle against the reality that he could no longer recover like before. Favre knew that everything he'd accumulated, fame, records, respect, couldn't save him from the accumulated traces of injury. The concussions that never truly went away, the joints and muscles worn down season after season. The pain wasn't just physical, it was mental. Favre had to face the fear that one day his body would force him to stop, and he wouldn't know how to live without football, without that sense of existing through the field. But he'd never learned how to let go, never learned how to rest. That's why he kept playing, kept taking the field, kept enduring. Despite every warning from his body, the strongest man in the NFL, the one America once cheered and honored, now lived by a silent but fierce reason: to exist, to affirm that he had never disappeared, even as his body began to betray him. Every game, every throw, every run carried a pain the audience couldn't see. Favre stepped onto the field like a soldier, not to win anymore, not to make history anymore, but to keep moving forward, to stay upright, to prove his existence still held value. No one saw the exhaustion, no one saw the accumulating wounds, no one knew that inside this legend was a man fighting his own body and his own memories. Favre couldn't let go, couldn't stop, and that was exactly what created the tragedy. He'd given his entire life to football. And football never forgives, never stops, and never allows rest. Every continued game took something from him. He could never get back, and he still stepped onto the field, not for victory, but for existence. And because there was no other way, when the stadiums gradually emptied, when the cheers fell silent and the games were over, Brett Favre felt something for the first time in his life that had never existed before: complete silence. No more stadium lights shining on his every run, no more roaring crowds, no more adrenaline flooding through him, making his heart pound and his body tense to every muscle. What remained was only emptiness, a vast, quiet space that left a man who'd lived on motion, on cheers and the crowd's heartbeat, suddenly feeling hollow. For the first time, he had nowhere to hide, no field, no ball, no throw to mask the pain or the loneliness. Everything that had kept him standing, everything that had made him feel he existed, was gone, and Favre had to face himself directly with his limits, his fears. The wounds accumulated from 2 decades of relentless endurance. His body, once trained to withstand every hit, now betrayed him in the quietest yet cruelest way. Old injuries, concussions that never fully healed, joints and muscles worn down season after season, suddenly became starkly clear when there was no field to fill that emptiness. Favre realized that no skill, no achievement, no title could hide the loneliness and fear that had followed him from Overbrook, from the early days of being seen as not enough, from those first games when his body was already tired. Now, with the ball no longer flying, with the cheers vanished, Favre had to confront the feeling that he had no support left except himself. It wasn't just physical. Favre's mind suddenly became so empty that he could clearly feel every hit, every pain he'd tried to bury. Childhood memories, injuries, moments of failure, cracks in his marriage and family all came back vividly now, no longer shielded by fame, career, or the image of the strong man the world had once admired. For the first time in his life, Favre couldn't escape anything. No escaping into the field, no escaping into cheers, no escaping into throws or wins. He had to face everything he'd been through, everything he'd endured, everything he'd given without ever getting back. In those early post-career days, Favre felt loneliness like something physical, a heavy pressure bearing down on his shoulders, his heart, his head. Every morning waking up with no practice schedule, no games, no team, he looked out at the emptiness ahead and realized the world had moved on without him. Adrenaline, the energy that had carried him through every season, every hit, every game for over 20 years, was gone. He suddenly felt disconnected from the rhythm that had defined his entire life, a feeling that strength, titles, or anything he'd ever had couldn't fill. And in that emptiness, the fear of that little boy from Mississippi came rushing back. Fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, fear that everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, would now disappear. No more field to prove himself on, no more fans to acknowledge him. Favre had to sit still for the first time and face his own pain, nothing to hide behind, nothing to distract him from the truth that his body was tired, his memory weakening, and parts of his youth, strength, and time had slipped away forever. But in that silence and emptiness, Favre also found something he'd never felt while playing: the truth about himself, no longer masked by achievements or cheers. He realized true strength wasn't standing tall on the field, but daring to face himself when there was no field, no lights, no witnesses. Every ache, every memory, every injury now became a mirror reflecting a man who'd never been allowed to see himself. For the first time, he didn't run from it. For the first time, he had to sit still and feel it all. And that was the most painful thing, but also the moment when true existence began to be understood, and when all the cheers had faded, when the stadium stood empty and his body gradually gave in to time. Brett Favre began to feel something more terrifying than any hit on the field. His own mind starting to turn against him. Memories, once the precious treasure of a legendary career, now grew hazy. Details that were once sharp became jumbled. Games, throws, wins he'd once been proud of suddenly felt distant. It wasn't just temporary memory loss. It was a slow feeling of being pulled away from the life he'd given his entire youth and mind to football for. He gave his mind to the game, and now it's slipping away. Not in one day, not in one moment, but piece by piece of memory, detail by detail, moment by moment, accumulated over 20 years of endurance slipping from his mind, forcing Favre to face an enemy for the first time in his life that he couldn't force or dodge himself. The first signs appeared quietly, like small waves creeping into everyday life. He forgot conversations, forgot key throws in big games, forgot promises. even forgot some of the wins that had built his name. Every time he tried to recall the past, Favre clearly felt the voids his memory left behind. A deep, silent emptiness that couldn't be filled. With no fans, no teammates, no field to hide or fill it. Everything grew still, and the loneliness he'd once escaped, through throws, through games, through fame, now returned fully and more fiercely than ever. The fear of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy from repeated concussions, became a haunting shadow in Favre's mind. Every hit, every season, every game he'd powered through with pride and defiance now felt like bricks building an invisible wall, trapping him in fear of what would happen to his brain. He understood that injuries the body could still endure might leave lasting consequences, and the scariest part was not knowing when it would cross the line. When he realized he no longer had full control over his memory and focus, Favre faced a feeling no athlete, no NFL icon had ever experienced: the loss of self while still alive. Every day, Favre struggled to hold on to important memories, to remember he'd once led the Packers, once been MVP, once been an NFL icon. But his memory betrayed him slowly and cruelly. Moments he'd once laughed about with teammates, wins the whole nation admired, now only faint. And that left him with a loneliness more terrifying than standing before an empty stadium. Nothing left to hide behind, nothing to lean on except himself, and now himself had become an enemy he couldn't defeat. In the silence, Brett Favre had to face the truth he'd once avoided. A body and mind that had once served football, that had once lifted him to legendary heights, were now turning their backs on him. No one could save him from the accumulated consequences of 20 years of endurance, thousands of hits, games where he'd forced himself forward despite his body's betrayal. Every moment he realized he'd forgotten something important was another knife into an already exhausted will. Proof that strength and durability have limits, and that Favre, the man who'd once made millions admire him, now had to struggle to accept that not everything he fought to hold on to could last forever. But in that despair, a quiet flame still burned. Favre realized he'd given his entire self to something he loved, something that had shaped who he was, his whole life: football. And even as memory faded, even as his body was no longer perfect, even as the fear of CTE grew clearer, he still had the ability to stand up, move forward, throw, run on the field in his recollections. In moments when memory hadn't fully left him, Favre understood that true strength wasn't in muscle or achievements, but in the ability to face himself, his limitations, the unseen wounds, and still keep going. Every day was a challenge, but also proof that the man who'd given his mind to the game had never truly quit, even as everything around him slowly slipped from his grasp. And so, every moment, Favre recognized the truth about his memory and health was a silent blow to himself, but at the same time a testament to his extraordinary will. He no longer controlled everything, but he still kept moving forward. He gave his mind to the game, and now it's slipping away. Every pass, every run, every game, even in fading memory, remained an affirmation that Brett Favre existed, that he still stood tall, that he was still the icon of endurance, a legend, not just of talent, but of surviving every limit, every hit, every drifting memory. And then, like every legend who's ever faced trials, Brett Favre had to confront something no hit, no physical injury could ever prepare him for: the eyes of the world. The Mississippi scandal, the controversy involving the welfare fund he was accused of being tied to, exploded across newspapers, social media, and conversations he wasn't even part of. Instantly, the name Brett Favre no longer just evoked wins, spectacular throws, or legendary gains. It evoked controversy, doubt, a disappointment the public placed squarely on his shoulders. No evidence needed, no careful analysis, just headlines and hashtags, and images of Favre framed in harsh attack. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. Favre didn't try to turn the scandal into a comeback story, didn't use his fame or celebrity to cover it up, didn't seek to escape because he understood clearly what he'd learned his whole life. If you try to prove you're not wrong, you'll get sucked into an endless vortex. And that became even clearer when every criticism came wrapped in assumptions, judgments, hasty conclusions he knew he couldn't change. The world looked at him, and all they saw was a Favre who was both extraordinary and flawed, an icon with real mistakes. But beneath the public's gaze, there was another story they couldn't see. A man still struggling, still standing tall, still finding ways to move forward despite all the external pressure. Favre had to learn to accept that no matter what he said, what he explained, people would still see what they wanted to see, and instead of getting angry or fighting back, he stayed silent, kept himself from collapsing, kept his own image from shattering completely. He learned to live under attack, to keep stepping forward even when the world seemed to turn its back, to acknowledge that a person, no matter how great, can still make real mistakes. Not every mistake can be fixed. Not every action gets forgiven. But Brett Favre didn't hide, didn't turn himself into an innocent hero, didn't turn the scandal into a redemption drama. He just stood there with all his real self, with every mistake he'd made, with choices he'd once been proud of and others he'd regretted. He was a real man, a real legend, but also a real human with real flaws. And that very thing made his story more admirable than any win on the field. Old teammates, coaches, and fans who once admired him now had to adjust their view of Favre. They realized that behind the long bombs, the victories, and the records was a man enduring unimaginable pressure. A man learning to face the consequences of his decisions and choices in life. Favre didn't apologize for his image, didn't judge others, didn't seek revenge on the public. He simply kept moving forward. Still, Brett Favre resilient, enduring, but now also someone who truly understood the value of every moment, every decision, and even every real mistake. In the days that followed, everything around Favre changed. Media attention didn't stop, but he'd learned not to let it destroy him. Every call, every article, every online comment was just part of a world he couldn't control. And instead of stressing or reacting harshly, Favre focused on the only thing he still could: himself, his health, and what he could still do to keep existing. He played football, but now not to prove anything to the world. He played for himself, for the passion no scandal could take away. The key lesson Favre took from that time was a simple but profound truth. A person, no matter how great, will still make mistakes, and making mistakes doesn't make that person weak or unworthy of respect. On the contrary, facing the consequences, standing firm after the criticism, and continuing to live with all the pain, all the regret, that's the mark of a real, strong, honorable person. Brett Favre, through every scandal, through every critical stare, still stood there, still moved forward, and that more than any record, any victory proved he was an icon of resilience, of humanity, and of the ability to exist despite everything. And so, when the world turned its back and criticized, Favre remained Brett Favre, a real person, with real mistakes, with real pain, but still resilient, still moving forward, still existing, and still leaving an indelible mark on NFL history. A man with real mistakes. When all the cheers had fallen silent, when the stadiums no longer held crowds, and the lights no longer illuminated his runs, Brett Favre realized a truth he'd never had to face before. He no longer had anywhere to run, no more games to hide in, no more adrenaline to fill the voids in his body, no more spotlight to mask the pain accumulated over 2 decades on the field. Favre, who'd spent his life proving durability, now had to confront himself with the limits his body and memory were beginning to impose, and with the consequences of choices he'd once thought were the only way to survive. He looked to his family, The people who'd long been his drive and his foundation for standing tall. His son, his daughter, his wife, the ones who'd stood behind him in the shadows, now became the only reflections showing he was still a man, not just a legend on the field. In the silence, Favre began to realize that everything he'd chased, all the fame, all the MVP and Super Bowl achievements, couldn't fill the gaps left by the truth of aging, health, and injuries. Family wasn't just witnesses. They were mirrors reflecting the pain he'd tried to hide. Those quiet evenings, with only the ticking clock and the breathing of loved ones nearby, Favre listened to himself, to his heart, to his body. And for the first time, with no field to escape to, no crowd to bury the pain under, he had to face it all head on. In that silence, Favre reflected on the path he'd walked. The games, the throws, the glorious moments that had once shown his strength and will, now appeared like quiet knives. He realized his strength wasn't in muscle or speed, but in the ability to keep moving forward despite every limit and pain. But now, with no chance to run anymore, with his body no longer responding like before, Favre had to learn to stand still, to become aware and face everything he'd been through, all the consequences of relentless dedication and decisions he'd once believed necessary to survive. He looked back at every step, every season, every wound, and every moment that had forged who he was. But this time, Favre didn't look at victories, didn't look at MVPs or Super Bowls. He looked at the truth that every moment he survived a hit, every time he pushed through pain to throw or scramble, had accumulated into parts of him no one could see. Those silent years, those solitary moments, now became a mirror reflecting every effort, every sacrifice, every pain, and every determination Favre had poured into football and his career. Favre reflected on everything he'd given to survive, on the silent pain only he knew. He realized running had never truly been an option. From Overbrook to the Packers, from the Jets to the Vikings. He'd learned to keep going despite every limit, despite every pain. But now he could no longer run. No more games, no more adrenaline, no more stadium lights to fill the loneliness and emptiness. He had to face himself, look at what remained, seek value in existence without the field or the crowd. In the silence and reflection, Favre also found a quiet comfort. Family was still there, still his anchor, still the place he could live without performing, without proving anything. Favre realized true strength wasn't in wins or records, but in the ability to stand firm, to exist, and to recognize his own worth even without the field, without viewers, without lights shining down. No longer able to run, he had to learn to live with himself, to accept limits, to face pain, to find peace in silence. And in that moment, Brett Favre understood that his entire career, all his fame, all his victories, were just the surface of a man who lived by will and endurance. What remained, the things he held in his heart, in his mind, in his family, and in those silent moments, was his true legacy. A man with nowhere left to run, no field to hide in, but still standing tall, still existing, still himself, amid the wounds, amid the pain, amid the silence he'd never known before. And now, as Brett Favre looks back on it, all the games, the titles, the Super Bowls, the MVPs, the glorious moments when all of America cheered, the seasons without rest, the silent wounds that accumulated, and even the mistakes, the scandals, the pain he had to endure. Favre realizes a truth that no praise, no cheers, no medal could ever hide. He didn't win completely. Not in his career, not in his life, and not against himself. What he once saw as success, as the symbol of strength and will, was all built on a foundation of endurance, on a worn-down body, on a memory slowly fading, and on a soul that had once been too exhausted to admit limits. Favre didn't overcome everything. He never could fully overcome all the pain that life and football handed him. But right in that truth, in the acceptance of limits and things that can't be fixed, Brett Favre finds a different kind of strength, one that can't be measured by titles, stats, or fan applause. It's the strength of endurance itself. Every hit his body ever took, every pain he suppressed, every season he forced himself onto the field when every reason to rest existed, all of it accumulated into a quiet strength, a survival instinct no one else could understand. Favre knows he paid a price and is still paying for the decisions, the choices, for everything he gave completely to the game he loved so much he never stopped. But paying a price doesn't mean destruction. Favre is still alive. He still gets out of bed every morning, still faces his family, still talks, still laughs, still takes part in activities, events, meetings without stadium lights shining down or roaring crowds. He endures the consequences of age, injuries, fading memory, and public pressure. But he keeps living, keeps existing, keeps holding on to the truest version of himself he can. That resilience, not flashy, not celebrated, not recorded in books of records, is Brett Favre's true legacy. In those quiet moments, Favre looks at himself and sees clearly that surviving every game, every season, every year of non-stop endurance is the real victory. Not victory over opponents, not victory over the scoreboard, but victory over himself, over the limits his body and mind imposed, over the fear that he would disappear into the shadow of the greatness he once created. Favre didn't overcome everything, but he's still here. He still lives, still feels, still sees his children, his family, his friends, and still keeps moving forward in a world that witnessed how many times he fell, how many times he rose, how many times he forced himself to continue. And right in that truth, in accepting that he's not perfect, that he couldn't win everything, that every pain, every injury, every mistake still exists, Favre finds a kind of freedom that titles or medals never brought. The freedom to be himself, with all his mistakes and pain, with all his memories and losses. He understands that strength isn't in never falling. It's in daring to keep going, daring to endure, daring to pay the price, and daring to live despite it all. Every day that passes, Brett Favre keeps living with the deep understanding that life isn't a string of perfect victories. It's a journey of endurance, the ability to face pain, the acceptance of every choice's consequences, and still moving forward. He endured, he paid the price, and he keeps living. That's the final message. Tragic, yet full of power. Not everyone can see it, but that's exactly what makes Brett Favre who he really is. An imperfect legend, yet extraordinary in his capacity to endure and keep living. And as his story comes to a close, one thing stands clear. Brett Favre didn't win completely, didn't overcome everything, but through it all, he still exists. He remains the icon of durability, of will, and of survival, a man who gave his whole life, paid the price, and kept moving forward, whether the world kept applauding or not. A real person, with real pain, with real endurance, and with real life. The story of Brett Favre is a vivid portrait of greatness, accompanied by silent pain, proof that even the most celebrated and admired people carry burdens no one sees. From his childhood days in Mississippi, where he learned to toughen up, hide emotions, and turn pain into strength, to his NFL era with a streak of 297 consecutive games, every moment on the field wasn't just victory. It was a battle with his body and mind. Favre endured challenges few can imagine, accumulated injuries, concussions, persistent pain, the pressure of fame, public mistakes and scandals, all faced not with resentment or avoidance, but with relentless will and a spirit of never fall. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't the times he was criticized or his body betrayed him, but the way he had to keep walking in silence, facing pain only he knew. From this story, Americans can draw valuable lessons. First, will and endurance are worthy of honor, but true strength isn't in hiding. pain, it's in recognizing and facing it. Second, success and fame can't replace caring for physical health, mental health, and family relationships. As Favre, despite his greatness on the field, still paid with silent suffering. Finally, his story reminds us that everyone has limits, and acknowledging those limits doesn't weaken a person. It helps us learn to live authentically, care for ourselves, and cherish what's most important: family, health, and genuine relationships. Brett Favre isn't an icon of perfection, but an icon of resilience, courage, and the ability to keep living despite every wound. A role model every American can learn from and feel in real life. If Brett Favre's story has touched you and made you reflect, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next parts, where we'll continue exploring the challenges and untold moments in this extraordinary journey. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where resilience, endurance, and life lessons will go even deeper.